prairie night was dark and cold. The 6 men hunkered in a buffalo wallow were wet, cold, and wounded too severely. Somewhere out of sight in the dark prairie were 125 Comanche and Kiowa warriors who had one desire: to kill them. Without horses and ammunition running low, their chances of surviving to the next night seemed impossible. They had, in fact, beaten the odds by surviving to this night. What had brought these 6 men to face a lonely death on the inhospitable Texas plain? On September 10th, 1874, Colonel Nelson Miles had sent 2 scouts, Billy Dixon and Amos Chapman, along with 4 troopers, Sergeant Z.T. Woodhull and Privates Peter Rath, John Harrington, and George Smith, to locate a missing supply wagons. Billy Dixon was not only an able scout, but an extremely skillful marksman. It was Dixon who had made the incredible 1,000-plus yard shot at the Second Battle of Adobe Walls. The 6 men set out on the trail to locate the wagons. On the morning of September the 12th, they found themselves confronted by 125 Comanche and Kiowa warriors. Since the Indians had burned off the prairie grass a few days before, the men were exposed with no cover. If they attempted to flee, the warriors would cut them off individually. The safest course of action was to dismount and make a stand. In a few minutes, Trooper Smith, who was holding the horses, fell with a bullet through his lungs. The horses stampeded, carrying with them the men's haversacks, canteens, coats, and blankets. Escape was now impossible. The only choice was to fight and die. The mounted warriors chose to play a game with their intended victims by circling them and firing on the stranded men. After a short time, Harrington and Woodhull were slightly wounded, and Chapman had his left knee shattered by a bullet. For a few minutes, the warriors broke off the engagement. Dixon, who was also slightly wounded, spotted a buffalo wallow a few yards away. The wallow offered better protection than being out in the open. He directed the men to take cover in the shallow depression, which was about 10 feet in diameter. All except the seriously wounded Chapman and Smith reached the wallow, and the men, using their hands and knives, began throwing up earth embankments around the perimeter for additional protection. From their improvised foxhole, they were able to protect themselves and keep the warriors away from Smith and Chapman. Dixon tried several times during the day to reach Chapman, but was forced back by a barrage of bullets and arrows. Chapman had lived among the Cheyenne for a time and was known to many of the warriors present. Rather than help him, the Comanche and Kiowa taunted him by shouting, "Amos, Amos, we got you now, Amos!" Dixon finally made it to Chapman and carried him back to the safety of the wallow in spite of intensive arrow and gunfire. Throughout the day, the men suffered from hunger, thirst, wounds, and charging warriors. Only their expert marksmanship kept the Comanche and Kiowa warriors back. Late in the afternoon, a thunderstorm brought relief to their thirst and ended the Indian attack for a time. The thunderstorm was the front of a blue norther, which on the Texas plains is an Arctic cold front. This weather change resulted in a severe drop in the temperature, bringing a new suffering to the men. At this point, ammunition was running slow, and with a lull in the fighting, Trooper Rath went to recover Smith's weapons and ammunition. Upon reaching Smith's body, he was surprised to discover that Smith was still alive. Dixon and Rath were able to carry the wounded trooper back to the wallow. Smith's wound, unfortunately, was mortal, and he died later that night. At nightfall, the warriors lost interest in the game and left. Dixon and Rath fashioned crude and relatively dry places for themselves and the other men. Rath went to get help. After 2 hours, he returned, unable to locate the trail. The following morning, September 13, was clear and no Indians in sight. Dixon went for help and found the trail. Soon he saw a column of cavalry in the distance and fired his gun to attract their attention. The unit was from the 8th Cavalry out of Fort Union, New Mexico, under the command of Major William R. Price. Price accompanied Dixon back to the Wallow, but did not have an ambulance or additional horses, and was running short on supplies himself. To make matters worse, one of the men in the Wallow mistook the approaching riders for Indians and shot the horse of one of the surgeon's assistants. Price, and I imagine the surgeon, to put it mildly, were unhappy. The surgeon briefly examined the man, and then Price marched on, refusing to give the men ammunition or food. He did, however, promise to notify Colonel Miles and send aid. It was nearly midnight, however, when help arrived, and the tired, hungry, and exhausted men received food and proper medical attention. Smith's body was wrapped in an army blanket and buried in the Wallow. The scouts were taken to Camp Supply for treatment. Amos Chapman's leg was subsequently amputated above the knee. Woodhull and Harrington recovered and continued their military service. Major Price was severely censured for his failure to render proper aid to the survivors, and his military career was finished. Colonel Miles recommended that the men be given the Medal of Honor for bravery under adverse circumstances. The medals were awarded, including a posthumous one for Smith. The Buffalo Wallow Fight was widely publicized as a heroic engagement. Nearly all accounts of the battle, including Dixon's, claim that the 6 men killed as many as 24 warriors. Comanche and Kiowa do not recount any losses, and later Amos Chapman stated that he did not believe any Indians were actually shot. Some years later, the medals of Chapman and Dixon were revoked by Congress since they had served the Army as civilian scouts, not military members. Dixon, however, refused to surrender what he felt he had justly earned. In 1925, a granite monument was erected on the site. Thank you for watching this video. It is greatly appreciated. Please take the time to subscribe to the channel if you haven't, comment on the video, and give it a like.